Welcome everyone, today is Wednesday, we are on our first reset of Season 3 and what comes with the reset is the change from a Fortified week in Mythic Plus into a Tyrannical week in Mythic Plus. So after checking out the dungeons on Fortified, many players made themselves an idea on how those dungeons were, especially for example with the difficulty of the bosses, because now we are transitioning from Fortified to Tyrannical. So imagine all of the bosses you already found difficult on Fortified and started to imagine them in a Tyrannical week. So for today, we have a couple of things to check. Number one, of course, is the difficulty change from Fortified to Tyrannical, which are going to be the nastiest of the dungeons as well as the bosses in this new week, but also the tuning placed by Blizzard on the dungeons after observing the players enter Fortified dungeons in week 1. We have gotten a whole bunch of nerfs and a few buffs to some of these dungeons. Now, observing the progression of players in week 1 by looking at the number of keys completed as well as the average level of the key being completed, this is the difficulty of your dungeons in week 1 in a Fortified week, with unsurprisingly Atazar being the easiest of the dungeons. Unsurprisingly, some of the harshest dungeons also happen to have some of the nastier bosses. For example, many players are already quite worried about the difficulty of the Everbloom bosses in Tyrannical. Same goes for the Throne of the Tides bosses on Tyrannical, especially the first one with her Chain Lightning, now on Tyrannical doing 80% of your HP, the last boss also being quite nasty, not to mention the poor tank having to now deal with a Tyrannical Stone Speaker dropping a Wind Fury totem and basically one-shotting the tank every once in a while. So what were the Blizzard's adjustments to these dungeons in their hotfixes? The first one being Atazar. Atazar has the required enemy forces count increased. That's one of the major positives of Atazar, having a very easy thrash count and also a very small thrash count. This is getting increased. In return though, quite a few of the mobs in Atazar are getting nerfed. The toxic saurids, so the small little shits that jump on you, now no longer automatically apply poisoned claws when they jump on you. The TLDR is that their leap is now doing some 30 to 40% less damage than before, which greatly helps with the pain of getting targeted by 3 of them at the same time, one-shotting you. Now that's gonna happen less often. You also have the Juggernaut's Merciless Assault, a favorite mechanic this season, the mechanic of one enemy randomly jumping to a random spot and starting to whirlwind, starting to spin around and kill you in 2 hits if you stay there. That's being nerfed by 25%. Those are the only 2 relevant changes in Atazar, because the rest of the changes are not really gonna impact you too much. One is the change to Wildfire, now doing even more damage, which doesn't really matter because you're not supposed to let Wildfire cast in the first place. And number 2, a series of changes to Dinomancer Kisho, Telonja and Monzumi. If you're wondering what the hell those even are, that's the pack in the middle of Atazar, the one that you skip every single time and will continue to skip every single time despite the changes Blizzard is putting on this trash pack. One of the changes that spooked the most the players when it came to Atazar was the change to Yasma, because Racking Pain can no longer be interrupted and is no longer going to be a curse effect in Mythic Plus. Players were pretty spooked because this ability, Racking Pain, was a lot of damage and basically was almost a wipe if you let it through and did not interrupt it. Now, this is basically just something for the healer to heal. You're not going to be getting the dot over time from this mechanic, you're only gonna get the initial hit. As I said, it's just to let the healer do something on this fight, because either you get one shot by the echoes of Shadra, by the little spiders, or you take basically no damage. So now with this mechanic you just get to heal a bit more on this boss fight. The other change on Atazar is the change to Priestess Alunza. Now Corrupted Blood inflicts damage more often, as well as the Spirit of Gold's add on the fight is 33% healthier, so you have to dump more damage into this mob. Those are the changes to Atazar, which overall make it more challenging, make it more difficult. It should still remain one of the, if not the, easier of the dungeons though. After Atazar, you have the changes to what is considered the hardest, what was considered the hardest dungeon in this week of Fortified, which is Mortons Rise. You have the major changes to Tyr, which is surprising because Tyr wasn't actually the one considered one of the harder bosses in this dungeon, the first boss of the dungeon. The Radiant Barrier damage absorb has been reduced by 15%, together with Radiant Barrier's refresh damage reduced by 25%. Also, the Time Stream's Anomalies Untwist damage has been reduced by 20%. This is very good because this trash mob was very nasty in Mythic Plus. Time Displacement reduced the creature's health by an additional 10%, as well as time displacement on death damage effect reduced by 50%. This is also quite good for the trash mobs, as well as even better for the safety and the health of tanks. Increased the cooldown of double strike and triple strike, as many of the mobs around the major, larger platform in this dungeon were brutalizing the tank. These are getting overall nerfed. So the hardest of the dungeon gets more nerfs when it comes to the thrash mobs. You do also have some changes, specifically nerfs to the last boss of Mortons Rise, to Chrono Lord Deos. The health of the boss is reduced by 10%, and the infinite corruption damage has been reduced by 20%. These are the swirlies around the room whenever he blasts Nosdormu with damage. A bunch of swirlies fall down the ground. They still do a lot of damage and borderline one-shot you. This damage nerf might allow you to survive one hit if it's one of the small swirlies, so it might help a bit on that encounter. It's good to see though that we see nerfs to the harshest of the dungeons. We are not done because another of the harshest dungeons was Throne of the Tides. What about the nerfs to Throne of the Tides? Reduced the total number of unstable corruption spawns, and unstable corruption now spawn more consistently. This was the dreaded Gauntlet before the last boss of Throne of the Tides. Very difficult to go through. You also have nerfs to the Vicious Snapdragon's Razor Jaws, now ticking every 1.5 seconds for the bleed instead of 1 second. Also, the Snapdragon has his health reduced by 20%. Another one of the more challenging parts of that Gauntlet side of the trash was the Gill Goblin Aquamage. Those little motherfuckers spamming casts on random players, basically chunking them to 30% HP, meaning that if two of them ever targeted you at the same time, you would get one shot. Either the Hunter spamming Throw Spear or the Aquamage spamming Aqua Blast. Either way, they were way too damaging. Now you get a 20% health reduced on the Aquamage, making it faster to kill it, as well as the Aqua Blast cast time increased to 4 seconds. Still no nerf to the other goblin in that pack, the Hunter with the Poison Spear and the Throw Spear. Those were actually even more dangerous and even more threatening than the Aquamage, but still, that's a start. Those are in the Gauntlet part, and the Gauntlet is already getting nerfed by quite a bit. Also, with the nerf to the Tainted Guardian's Swell damage reduced by 15%, another one of the deadly mechanics in that Gauntlet. Another helpful change, this time to save the sanity of your healer, is the Sentinel's Crushing Depth Heal Absorb reduced by 15%. Now, before you get happy about this change, Blizzard also hotfixed the line of sight denial of this mechanic. Meaning, now you can no longer pillar hump, like you were playing arena in PvP, and basically force the mob to recast this mechanic and then hide again. The mob has to change target, the new target hides, etc, etc, etc. You can no longer pull that cheese now, even with this absorb shield being nerfed by 15%, which is ultimately worse than what it is now and remains a major issue, especially with all of the lazy DPS refusing to land a couple of off heals on whoever gets hit by this absorb shield. Surprisingly, the only one boss being nerfed in this dungeon is Ozumat. Blotting Barrage, so the 3 players being targeted by the hit, the damage is reduced by 15%, and then the pools, the darkness pools on the ground also now do 25% less damage. The cleansing flux duration, the cleaning of all the filth on the ground, now lasts for 12 seconds instead of 10, and Foul Bolt now has an 8-second initial cooldown. Quite good series of nerfs to this boss. The only questionable part is whether or not the first and third boss of this dungeon will scale a bit too hard this week on Tyrannical, with a few of their very dangerous mechanics. Garrons Fall, on the other hand, was one of the easier dungeons in Fortified and receives only a couple of changes. Those are nerfs, and those are both to the trash mobs of the dungeon. Number 1, the Risen Dragon's Necrotic Outburst inflicts damage now every 3 seconds instead of every 2, which is very good because those were some nasty packs to have to do before the third, I think, boss. And then you have the other very good change to the Coalesced Moments Tainted Sands. This was the insanely hard ticking dot that you would get on the platform before the second boss that was casted instantly, had no reaction time, sometimes a couple of them went out at the same time or in quick succession. Now the nerf is that for starters, it lasts for 7 seconds instead of 9, and now it doesn't do damage immediately. It's now wait 1 second before its first tick happens. So effectively, it's gonna be ticking like 6 times instead of 9, which is quite a bit of less damage to have to deal with this dot. Then we have only a handful of changes to the last 3 dungeons being addressed: Darkheart Ticket, Blackroot Hold, and Waycrest Manor. Darkheart Ticket has Oakheart's Crushing Grip, throw damage reduced by 15%. Tanks will be happy about this change, as well as Maddening Roar damage, increased damage dealt by 20% per stack instead of 25%. This was the AoE of the big bears in Darkheart Ticket. Blackroot Hold, another very good change. This was a classic deplete window on this dungeon. It was the Gauntlet with the Felspite Dominators and the Bats. Now the Sick Bats cast, which will fixate a bunch of bats on a non-tank, will now command up to just 4 bats at a time to attack a specific target instead of all of them. This is a major boon to all the players messing up this entire gauntlet. For the record, the way to do this gauntlet, if you want to be slightly safe and you don't have that much movement, you kill the first Dominator alone, and then you run all the way up to the boss room, dragging behind you all of the remaining 3 Dominators. You pop your CDs, likely Bloodlust on Fortified, and kill them all. And because you run past the spawn point of the bats, there will be no more bats. Now the problem of this pool will be interrupting the 3 of them before they brutalize your tank. That will be the only problem left of this pool. But now, with this fixate change, with this fixate nerf of the bats, it's also more manageable to do this gauntlet a little bit more slowly. And then you have the slightest of the changes, which is more like a fix than anything, which is the Matron Alma's Lingering Dread should now prefer non-tank players. Those are all of the changes for today, the fixes for today to the dungeons of Mythic Plus. Interesting that most of the changes actually were focusing on trash mobs rather than actual bosses, even though we are entering a boss week with a Tyrannical. So we will get to see as the days go by just the power of many of these already dangerous bosses on Fortified, how much more they will become in Tyrannical for this week. For today, these were all of the changes, the hot fixes for Mythic Plus on this reset day, and I will leave you to the rest of your reset day as I also have things to do. So, with this out of the way, we're starting the goodbyes, of course, by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which can also, of course, be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, one of the things I have to do, for example, is to go and open my vault, which I have forgotten up until now. So let's see how triggered do I have to be for today.